Welcome to Sleepy Expeditions. Japan, a country that has been closed to the outside world for 250 years, is opening. An emperor who has been a ceremonial figure for 7 centuries is returning to real power. An army that has ruled Japan since before Columbus sailed to the Americas is dissolving. And you are sitting in a small room in Kyoto, listening to the silence, holding a cup of tea that has gone cold. You are a samurai. Not for much longer. Find a comfortable position. Let the imaginary tatami beneath you, firm, clean, smelling faintly of rush grass, hold your weight completely. Close your eyes. The paper walls are very thin tonight. The room is small. This is the Japanese aesthetic, not the vast, ornate interiors of European palaces, not the high ceilings and heavy furniture of the Western world that is, even now, pressing against Japan's borders with a persistence that can no longer be ignored. The room is small because smallness, properly understood, is not a limitation but a choice. A room this size can be known completely. Every proportion is considered, every object placed with intention. The tatami covers the floor in its precise grid, each mat exactly the same size, the seams between them following a pattern that has specific rules that have been observed in Japanese rooms for centuries because the rules produce a particular quality of space that deviation from them destroys. You know these rules the way you know everything about the physical world you inhabit, not as learned information but as absorbed reality, as the background against which you have lived your entire life. A single candle burns in its holder near the shoji screen. The shoji, the sliding screen of paper and wood that serves as both wall and window, glows faintly from the garden beyond it, where the moonlight is falling on the raked gravel and the pine that your lord planted 30 years ago, which has grown into something considered and asymmetrical in the way that Japanese gardens value. Not the symmetry of European formal gardens, not the declaration of human dominance over nature, but something more like a conversation between the gardener's intention and the tree's own tendency, the final shape the product of both. Your sword is on the stand beside you. The daisho, the paired swords of the samurai, the long katana and the shorter wakizashi, rests in its proper place, the blades cleaned and oiled this evening, as they are cleaned and oiled every evening, the lacquered scabbards undamaged, the tsuba, the handguard, polished to the degree that the dim candlelight catches it faintly. You do not know how many more evenings you will clean them. The decree has not yet arrived in this part of Kyoto with the force of law. These things move at the speed of human beings carrying paper, not at the speed of the electrical telegraph that the new government is installing along the roads and coastlines of Japan, with a haste that tells you everything you need to know about what kind of country this is becoming. But the content of the decree is known. It has been known for weeks, discussed in the low voices of men who are trying to decide what it means for them. The samurai class is to be abolished. Not the people, the class, the institution. The 700-year-old arrangement by which certain families are warriors and administrators, and the backbone of Japanese society. This arrangement is ending not through defeat in battle, but through the decision of a government that has concluded that Japan cannot survive the modern world as it currently is, and must become something different. You sit in your small room, you drink your cold tea, you think about 700 years. The word samurai means, literally, one who serves. This etymology is important and easily forgotten in the centuries of accumulated mythology that surround the word, the romantic image of the warrior philosopher, the perfect swordsman, the man who has mastered both the brush and the blade. The image is not entirely wrong, but it begins with service, and service implies a hierarchy. And the hierarchy is where the actual history lives. The samurai class emerged in the late Heian period, approximately the 10th and 11th centuries AD, from the armed retainers of the provincial aristocracy. Japan at this time was nominally governed by the imperial court in Kyoto, where the emperor and the great aristocratic families conducted an elaborate court culture of poetry and music and aesthetic refinement that was genuinely extraordinary and entirely disconnected from the practical business of governing the provinces. The provinces governed themselves, more or less. The great landowners of the provinces needed armed men to protect their estates, to enforce their authority over the peasants who worked the land, to defend against the armed men of other great landowners. These armed men developed over generations into a professional warrior class with its own culture, its own values, its own way of understanding the world. By the 12th century, the samurai had become powerful enough to dominate national politics. The Genpei War, fought between 1180 and 1185 between the Taira and Minamoto clans, was the moment when the samurai class took effective control of Japan. The Minamoto victory produced the first shogunate, the military government that would govern Japan in various forms for the next 7 centuries, while the imperial court in Kyoto continued to exist, continued to perform its rituals, continued to be technically sovereign, and exercised essentially no actual power. 700 years of warrior government, 700 years during which the samurai were not merely soldiers, but the administrative class of Japan, the men who collected taxes and adjudicated disputes and managed the logistics of governance and served their lords in every capacity that the running of a complex society requires. The sword was important, but the brush was equally important. A samurai who could not read and write and perform the administrative functions of his position was only half what he needed to be. This is the inheritance you carry, not just the sword training, though you began that at 6 years old with a wooden practice sword against a post in the yard, your father watching and correcting with the same patience and exacting standard that his father applied to him, and his father's father before that. But the calligraphy lessons, the poetry, the study of Chinese classics, the administrative knowledge of your domain, the protocol of relations between lords and retainers, and the emperor's court, you are, in the fullest sense of the word, a samurai, a thing that is about to cease to exist. The katana on the stand beside you was made 140 years ago. You know this because the blade is signed by its maker, a swordsmith from Bizen province whose name is cut into the tang. the portion of the blade that fits inside the handle, visible only when the blade is disassembled for deep cleaning. The signature is in characters so small and precise that they require good light and full attention to read, and you have read them many times over the years. This contact with the man who made the blade a form of connection across a century and a half. The swordsmith spent 3 months on this blade. 3 months of heating and folding and hammering the steel, the tamahagane, the jewel steel produced in the traditional smelting process, the iron, sand and charcoal combined in the tatara furnace. The resulting steel folded thousands of times to distribute the carbon evenly, to eliminate impurities, to produce the combination of hardness and flexibility that makes a Japanese blade what it is. The blade has a hardness gradient, harder at the edge, where hardness means sharpness and retention of sharpness, softer at the spine, where softness means flexibility and the ability to absorb shock without breaking. This gradient is visible in the hamon, the temper line that runs along the length of the blade, the boundary between the harder and softer steel, made visible by the differential polishing that produces the blade's characteristic appearance. You can see the hamon in the candlelight if you look at the blade at the right angle. The blade has been in your family for 4 generations. Your great-grandfather carried it in the Battle of Sekigahara, the decisive engagement of 1600 that established the Tokugawa shogunate, the regime that has now, after 268 years, come to its end. He survived that battle. Your grandfather carried it in a minor engagement in the early 18th century. Your father carried it his entire life and never used it in combat, because the Tokugawa peace had made combat between samurai increasingly rare, and a samurai who drew his blade in anger in the peace of the Edo period did so at significant legal risk. You have carried it for 30 years. You have used it twice in your life, both times in circumstances that were unavoidable, both times in accordance with the law and the code that governs the use of the blade. Both times afterward, you cleaned the blade carefully and returned it to its scabbard, and did not speak of what had happened, because speaking of it would have been a form of boasting, and boasting about the use of the sword is precisely what the code prohibits. The sword is not a weapon of pride. It is a weapon of last resort and final responsibility. You carry it because your station requires it, because the visible presence of the blade communicates something about who you are and what obligations you carry, because the samurai without his swords is not a samurai in any sense that the tradition would recognize. Tomorrow the law will change. The wearing of swords in public will be prohibited, not immediately, not everywhere. The enforcement will take time, but the intent is clear. The new government has decided that the visible presence of armed men from a hereditary warrior class is incompatible with the modern nation it is trying to build. The army it is creating will be a conscript army. Farmers and merchants and fishermen in Western-style uniforms, trained on Western methods, carrying Western rifles. The rifle that killed the Tokugawa era was not fired by any samurai. It was fired by men who had never carried a sword, who had been given Western weapons and Western training, who fought in a style that the traditional samurai arts had no answer to. You think about this. Looking at the blade in the candlelight, 140 years of history in 3 feet of folded steel. Bushido, the way of the warrior, is not a document. This is the first thing to understand about it, and the thing most frequently misunderstood by people who encounter it through the books written about it in the Meiji era, which are themselves a kind of retrospective construction, an attempt to articulate and systematize something that had previously existed as practice rather than theory. You did not learn Bushido from a book. You learned it from your father, who learned it from his father, who learned it from his, the transmission happening not through explicit instruction, but through the accumulation of example and correction over years. The values of the samurai class, loyalty, honor, self-discipline, the acceptance of death, the cultivation of both martial and aesthetic skill, were transmitted the way all deep cultural values are transmitted, through the experience of living within a community that embodies them and corrects deviation from them. Loyalty is the center of everything, not loyalty in the abstract sense, not loyalty to a principle or an ideal or a nation. Loyalty to a person, to your Lord, the man whose retainer you are, whose interests you serve, whose household you protect, whose decisions you implement. This loyalty is the organizing principle of your existence in a way that has no good equivalent in the Western political thought that is now flooding into Japan through the opened ports. In the Western conception, loyalty has conditions. You are loyal to your country, but your country has obligations to you. You are loyal to your Lord, but only insofar as he governs justly. There is a contractual element, an implicit negotiation, a point at which the conditions for loyalty cease to be met, and the loyalty itself legitimately ends. In the samurai tradition, loyalty is not conditional in this way, or rather, the conditions are set at the beginning, when you enter service, and from that point the question of whether the conditions are being met is not a question you revisit. Your Lord is your Lord. His failings are his own to answer for before whatever accounting awaits him. Your obligation is to serve him faithfully regardless, because the faithfulness is what you are, not a response to his merit. This is a very different way of organizing a life. You have thought about it more in the past months than in the previous 30 years. Because the new government is asking something of the samurai class that this tradition has no framework for. It is asking you to transfer your loyalty, not to a new lord, which the tradition can accommodate. Lords change, clans fall, retainers must find new masters, but to an abstraction, to Japan, to the nation, to the emperor, not as a person you serve, but as a symbol of something larger. This is what the Meiji reformers want. A population of loyal Japanese citizens, loyal to Japan, capable of being directed by the state toward whatever the state needs. Soldiers, factory workers, administrators of a modern bureaucracy. Not retainers bound to specific lords by specific relationships of personal loyalty and obligation, but citizens bound to a nation by the new kind of loyalty that modern states require. You understand what they are trying to build, you even understand why it is necessary, but understanding something and being it are different things. This evening, before the candle was lit and the thinking began, you performed the tea ceremony alone, which is permitted and which has its own particular quality, different from the ceremony performed with guests, which is a form of hospitality and communication, different again from the ceremony performed with your Lord, which carries the specific weight of that relationship. Alone, the ceremony is purely internal, a conversation between you and the practice itself. The room for tea, the cheshitsu, is a small space adjacent to the garden, entered through a low doorway that requires all who enter to bow, regardless of rank. This is intentional. The tea room is a space where the hierarchies of the outside world are suspended, where the shogun and the peasant, if they somehow found themselves in the same tea room, would be subject to the same protocol, would perform the same movements, would receive the same careful attention from the host. You prepared the space in the early evening. The scroll in the tokonoma, the alcove where art is displayed, you had chosen carefully, a brushwork painting of a pine branch in snow, done by a monk in the previous century, the brushstrokes as economical as anything can be, while still communicating what it communicates. The ink laid down with a confidence that comes from practice so thorough that hesitation is impossible. Each stroke complete in itself, the whole composition emerging not from planning, but from the accumulated skill of a lifetime applied in a few seconds of absolute attention. You hung the scroll yourself, adjusting it until the placement was correct. Not centered, because centering is the wrong kind of symmetry for this space, but offset in the way that the aesthetic of wabi-sabi requires, the asymmetry not accidental, but the result of a judgment about where the weight of the composition belongs. Then the flowers, a single stem of camellia in a simple ceramic vase, the kind of ceramic that the tea tradition prizes, which is not the elaborate decorated porcelain of the export trade, but something rougher and more honest. The glaze uneven, the shape not quite regular, the evidence of the maker's hand and the kiln's unpredictability visible rather than hidden. The imperfection is not a flaw, it is the truth of the object, and the truth of the object is part of what the ceremony is about. The ceremony itself is a sequence of precise movements. Cleaning the utensils, the whisk, the bowl, the scoop, with movements that are standardized to the degree that they can be performed correctly in any tea room in Japan, that communicate a shared language of care and attention to anyone who knows how to read them. Heating the water, measuring the tea powder into the bowl with the bamboo scoop, adding the water at the correct temperature, not boiling, which would scald the tea and destroy the flavor, but just below boiling, the temperature judged by the sound the water makes in the iron kettle, and the appearance of the bubbles forming on the bottom, whisking the tea into a froth, presenting the bowl, and then the drinking, turning the bowl slightly before drinking, so that the front of the bowl, the side most beautiful or most significant, does not touch the lips, a small gesture of respect for the object, an acknowledgement that the bowl is not merely a container but a presence, a thing with its own history and its own character that deserves consideration. The tea tonight tasted of something you could not name, Not bitterness, though the matcha has its characteristic depth. Not sadness, though something in the ceremony tonight carried a weight it does not always carry. Something more precise than either of those things. The taste of full attention paid to a thing that may not be repeated. The particular flavour of a last time that knows itself to be a last time. The ceremony ended. You cleaned the utensils. You returned them to their places. And then you sat in the main room with the candle and the cold tea and the sword on its stand. And the night began its long work of thinking. Your lord is a man of 56. He has been your lord for 23 years. You entered his service at the age of 19, following the death of your father who served his father before him. The connection between the two families going back 4 generations, and deep enough that the transfer of loyalty from one generation to the next required no particular ceremony, was simply the continuation of something already established. He is not a great lord. This is worth being honest about. He governs a modest domain in a province that has not been at the center of Japanese political history in living memory. His income is sufficient but not generous. His household is maintained with care but without extravagance. He is not the kind of man whose name will appear in the histories that are written about this period. The accounts of the Meiji Restoration will focus on the great lords who supported or opposed it, on the imperial court, on the leaders of the new government and the leaders of the resistance. He will be a footnote, if that. But he is your lord, and the relationship between you is not a footnote. He is a serious man who takes his obligations seriously, which is the most important thing that can be said about a lord in the tradition you both inhabit. He does not ask of his retainers what he does not ask of himself. He is present at the things that require his presence. He makes decisions that are his to make, and delegates what should be delegated. He is not brilliant, but he is careful, and in governance as in most things, careful is worth more than brilliant over the long run. He called you to his room 3 weeks ago. He sat across from you in the formal position, and he told you without preamble what he had decided. He was going to cooperate with the new government. He was going to surrender his domain to the imperial administration, as the new government was requesting of all lords. He was going to accept the stipend that the government was offering to former lords in exchange for their cooperation. He was going to become, in the language of the new Japan, a private citizen. He told you this without apology and without excessive explanation. He told you because you deserved to know, and because you had served him faithfully for 23 years, and because the decision affected you directly, you and all the other retainers whose positions existed because he was a lord with a domain to administer and protect. He said, "I am releasing you from your obligation." You said nothing for a moment. Then you said, "My obligation is not yours to release." He looked at you for a long moment, and then he nodded slightly in the way that he nods when someone has said something he cannot argue with and does not intend to argue with. The meeting ended. You returned to your room, and you have been thinking about what you said ever since, because you meant it and you are not entirely certain what it means. It began with ships. On July 8th, 1853, A squadron of 4 American naval vessels, 2 steam-powered paddle frigates, and 2 sailing sloops appeared in Edo Bay. They were commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry under orders from President Millard Fillmore to open Japan to American trade and to secure guarantees of protection for American sailors shipwrecked on Japanese shores. The ships were like nothing Japan had ever seen. Japan had ships. Japan had an extensive maritime tradition, fishing fleets and coastal traders that had connected the islands of the archipelago for centuries. But the ships in Edo Bay were different, powered by steam engines that produced a constant movement independent of wind, armed with guns of a caliber that dwarfed anything in the Japanese arsenal, painted black and trailing black smoke from their funnels in a way that the Japanese population that watched them from the shore found profoundly alarming. The word that passed through the population was Kurofune, black ships. Perry delivered his letter from President Fillmore to the Tokugawa officials who met him, made clear that he would return the following year for an answer, and sailed away. The year he left Japan in between was one of the most significant in its history, a year in which the shogunate's inability to simply turn the black ships away made its weakness visible to everyone who had been watching. The shogunate consulted the emperor, a thing it had not done in any meaningful way for centuries. The emperor's court consulted was not helpful. Various lords advocated various positions. The debate that should have been internal became public, and the public nature of it, the visible uncertainty of a government that had always presented itself as beyond question, was itself a kind of damage. Perry returned in 1854 with 8 ships. The Convention of Kanagawa was signed, opening 2 Japanese ports to American ships. The system of Sakoku, the closed country policy that had kept Japan isolated from most of the world for 2.5 centuries, began its rapid unraveling. More treaties followed, with Britain, with Russia, with France and the Netherlands, each one further opening Japan, further binding it to the international trading system, further demonstrating that the world outside Japan's borders was not the manageable quantity it had been when the isolation began. The shogunate, which had maintained its authority in part through the management of Japan's relationship with the outside world, found that authority eroding as that relationship became too complex and too consequential to be managed by the existing structures. The crisis was not simply about trade. It was about what the appearance of those ships revealed, that Japan, which had been the center of its own world for 2.5 centuries, was in fact a small country on the edge of a much larger world, a world in which other countries had developed technologies and organizational capacities and military power that Japan currently could not match. The response to this revelation divided Japan. Some said, "We must resist. Japan must remain Japan. The foreigners must be expelled." The slogan of the movement was "Sono Joy," revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, and it attracted supporters from across the samurai class, who saw in the shogunate's capitulation to Western pressure a betrayal of everything Japan should be. Others said, "We must adapt, not capitulate, adapt. The Western powers are more powerful than we are today because they have developed certain things that we have not. We must develop those things. We must study the West, learn what it knows, take what is useful, and use it to make Japan strong enough that no foreign power can ever point black ships at our coast and make demands. This second position won. The Meiji Restoration of 1868, the return of imperial rule, the dismantling of the shogunate, was the victory of the adapters over the resistors. And the adapters were correct in the strategic sense. Japan would spend the next 40 years transforming itself at a speed that astonished the world, becoming by 1905 a power capable of defeating Russia in war, the first Asian nation to defeat a European power in the modern era. But the transformation required sacrifices, and you are one of them. What is being lost is not easy to name. The reformers would say, not much. The samurai class was an economic burden, a hereditary aristocracy supported by stipends drawn from the agricultural production of the domains they administered, performing functions that a modern bureaucracy could perform more efficiently and at lower cost. The military function of the samurai has been made obsolete by modern weapons and modern tactics. The administrative function can be performed by trained officials who do not need to be born into a particular class to do it. They are not wrong about any of this. The world that is ending was not without its costs and its injustices. The rigid class system of Tokugawa Japan, samurai at the top, then farmers, then artisans, then merchants, and below all of them the outcast groups who performed the work that the class system declared impure. This system produced stability, but the stability came at a price paid unevenly across the population. The farmers who produced the rice that supported the samurai class had no say in the policies of the domain. The merchants whose commercial activity was creating the economic dynamism that was slowly transforming Japan from below had no political standing proportionate to their economic importance. The outcast communities performed essential functions and were denied essential dignities. The new Japan that is being built will be, in important ways, more just than the old one. You know this, but what is being lost is also real, and dismissing it as nostalgia or as the self-interest of a class defending its privileges is insufficient. What is being lost is a way of understanding the relationship between a human being and the world they inhabit. The samurai tradition, at its best, offered something that is genuinely valuable and genuinely rare, a comprehensive account of how a person should live. Not just what they should do professionally or politically, but what they should value, how they should carry themselves, what relationship they should have with their own mortality, how they should balance the claims of loyalty and honor and practical necessity when these things conflict. This account was not always followed. Human beings fall short of their ideals in every culture and every era, and the gap between the ideals of Bushido and the actual behavior of the samurai class across its history is as large as such gaps always are. There were cowardly samurai and dishonest samurai, and samurai who cared more for their stipends than for their lords. The ideal existed alongside its consistent violation, as all ideals do, but the ideal itself, the aspiration to live in a way that takes seriously the obligations of loyalty, The importance of self-discipline, the necessity of facing death honestly, the value of aesthetic cultivation alongside martial skill. This is something that is being swept away along with the stipends and the swords and the class system, and it is not obvious that the New Japan has something to replace it with. The New Japan has progress, it has industry, it has science and medicine, and the telegraph and the railroad, and all the physical infrastructure of modernity. It has a constitution and a parliament and the mechanisms of modern governance. What it does not yet have is a way of telling its citizens what they are for. The new government is moving with extraordinary speed. In the 5 years since the Restoration, Japan has changed more than it had in the previous 5 decades. The feudal domains have been abolished and replaced by prefectures administered by centrally appointed officials. A new army is being built on the Western model. Conscript soldiers trained by French and then German military advisors, armed with modern rifles, organized in the formations that European armies have developed through centuries of warfare. A navy is being constructed with British assistance. Schools are opening throughout the country, teaching a curriculum that includes Western science and mathematics alongside traditional Japanese subjects. The young men who are staffing the new government's ministries are extraordinary. Many of them are samurai from the domains that supported the Restoration, particularly Satsuma and Choshu, the 2 great southwestern domains whose alliance drove the military campaign that restored imperial rule. These men, trained in the samurai tradition, have taken it upon themselves to dismantle that tradition in the service of building something new. They are, in their way, the most thoroughgoing modernizers Japan has ever produced, precisely because they understand what they are dismantling from the inside. Ito Hirobumi, who will eventually write Japan's constitution, is the son of a low-ranking samurai family. Yamagata Aritomo, who is building the new army, is a samurai from Choshu. The men who are ending the samurai class are themselves members of it, and they have concluded that the class must end for Japan to survive. You do not entirely disagree with their analysis. This is the honest position, and honesty is a value the tradition demands of you even when honesty is uncomfortable. The world that arrived in Edo Bay in 1853 is not a world that Japan as it was could have survived indefinitely. The black ships were not going to go away because Japan wished them to. The Western powers were not going to stop their expansion into Asia because the people of Asia found it objectionable. Japan had 2 choices: transform or be transformed. The men currently running the government chose transformation on Japan's own terms, which was the only dignified option available. But transformation on your own terms is still transformation, and the terms include the end of what you are. Not everyone is accepting the change quietly. You know this. The news reaches even this quiet corner of Kyoto. The resistance that is forming in the southwest, particularly in Satsuma, the great domain whose samurai were at the center of the Meiji Restoration, and who now find themselves increasingly marginalized by the government they helped create. Saigo Takamori. The name is spoken with reverence in certain circles, with anxiety in others. He was one of the great figures of the Restoration, a man of enormous physical presence and personal authority, a samurai whose commitment to the ideals of the tradition was as complete as any man's alive. He supported the restoration, fought for it, helped shape the new government, and then he left it. The reasons are complex and debated, but at their center is something simple. Saigo believed that the new Japan was abandoning the values that had made Japan worth fighting for. The introduction of conscription, the idea that any man, regardless of class or training, could be a soldier, was, to Saigo and men like him, a fundamental betrayal. Not because they feared the competition, because the samurai's relationship to warfare was not merely professional but spiritual, and the reduction of military service to a function that any citizen could perform drained it of the meaning that had sustained the tradition for 7 centuries. In 1877, Saigo will lead an uprising, the Satsuma Rebellion, that is the last significant armed resistance to the Meiji government. 40,000 samurai will fight against the new conscript army. They will lose, not because they fight badly. They fight with everything the tradition has given them, with the skill and the courage and the acceptance of death that Bushido demands. They lose because the conscript army has better weapons and better logistics and the organizational capacity of a modern state behind it, and these things are, in this kind of conflict, decisive. Saigo will die in the final battle, according to the tradition by his own hand, the ritual suicide of the samurai who faces defeat, the final assertion of control over the only thing that remains within his control. This has not happened yet. As you sit in your room tonight, Saigo is still alive, still in Satsuma, still a figure of enormous weight in the national imagination. The rebellion is years away, but you know, sitting here, that something like it was always inevitable, because the tradition does not end quietly. It ends the way everything that has sustained itself for 7 centuries ends, with the people who embodied it making one last demonstration of what it was capable of, one last proof that the values were real, that the training was real, that the willingness to die in their service was not merely rhetoric, but actual fact. You will not be at Satsuma. This is a decision you have made and unmade and made again over the past months, and you have arrived at it not through cowardice. You have no fear of what Satsuma would require of you, but through the same honest analysis that led you to acknowledge the reformer's strategic correctness. Fighting would be a gesture, a real gesture, a meaningful gesture, a gesture that history would remember, but a gesture nonetheless. The outcome would not change. The new Japan would be built. The samurai class would be abolished. The only question is what you contribute to the world before that happens. And you have concluded that what you contribute is not a final battle. There is a concept in Japanese aesthetics called mono no aware. It translates approximately as the pathos of things, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, the particular emotion that comes from the recognition that beautiful things do not last, that the cherry blossom is beautiful precisely because it falls, that the awareness of an ending is part of what gives the thing ending its full weight. The cherry blossom has always been the samurai's flower. Not because of its beauty, though it is beautiful, because of its falling. The blossom blooms for a week, perhaps two, and then it falls, completely without resistance, at the moment of its fullest flowering. It does not cling, it does not attempt to extend itself beyond its season. It simply blooms and falls, and the falling is as complete and as perfectly executed as the blooming. This is what the samurai aspired to live fully, to serve faithfully, and when the moment of ending came, whether in battle or in old age or at the command of a lord, to fall completely, without resistance, with the same precision and commitment that characterized the living. You have spent your life trying to be worthy of this aspiration. You have not always succeeded. No one always succeeded. No one always succeeded. The aspiration is not a description of what you are, but a direction in which you have consistently tried to move, the standard against which you have measured yourself and found yourself sometimes adequate and sometimes wanting and always trying. Tonight, the aspiration asks something specific of you. It asks you to fall well, not in the physical sense. There is no battle here, no literal falling, but in the sense of accepting what is ending with the completeness that the tradition demands. Not fighting what cannot be changed because fighting it would be undignified. Not collapsing into grief or resentment because those would also be undignified, but accepting fully, honestly, with clear eyes, that the world you inhabited is ending, that what you are is ending with it, and that the acceptance itself is the final practice of the values you have spent a lifetime practicing. Mono no aware, the beauty of the thing because it ends, the weight of this moment because there will not be another like it. 700 years of the samurai tradition and you are somewhere near its end, in a small room in Kyoto with a cold cup of tea and a sword on its stand, and the night is very quiet and the candle is burning lower. You blow out the candle. In the darkness you find the shoji by memory and slide it open. The garden at night is different from the garden in daylight. In daylight, the raked gravel pattern is visible, the precise lines drawn by the rake each morning, the pattern that represents water in motion, the circular patterns around the stones that represent the way water moves around obstacles. In daylight you see the intention of it, the human mind expressed in the arrangement of inert material. At night you see something else. The moonlight falls on the gravel without discrimination. It does not know the difference between the raked lines and the stones, between the pine tree and the ground beneath it. It simply falls, as moonlight has always fallen, on whatever is beneath it. The garden in moonlight is not a human composition but a natural one. The moonlight deciding what is visible and what is shadow. The composition different from anything the gardener intended, and perhaps more beautiful for that. You walk barefoot on the smooth stones of the path. The pine tree your lord planted 30 years ago stands at the garden's center. Its asymmetrical form more visible in moonlight than in daylight. The irregular shape of its growth, the particular way it has responded to the light and the wind and the soil of this specific garden over 30 years. Readable in the moonlight as a kind of slow autobiography. You have walked this garden for 23 years. You know every stone of the path, every placement of the raked gravel, every sight line from every position. You know where to stand to see the moon reflected in the small stone basin at the garden's edge. You know where the pine tree's shadow falls at midsummer noon and at midwinter midnight. You know this garden the way you know anything that you have paid full attention to for a long time. Tonight you walk it slowly, not as a farewell. Farewells are for departures, and you are not departing, not tonight, not by your own choice, but as an act of full attention, the deliberate practice of being present to something you value, the kind of attention that the tea ceremony taught you to bring to a bowl of tea, and that applies equally to a moonlit garden on a night that will not repeat itself. The gravel is cool through your socks. The pine tree is still. The moon is very bright. You stand at the garden's edge and you look at the reflection in the stone basin. The moon doubled, one in the sky and one in the water, both equally real and equally transient. The water one disturbed by the smallest movement of air, and the image gone, the original continuing in the sky regardless. Japan is changing. You are not, but you are still here, in this garden, in this moonlight, with this sword, and this tradition, and this cup of cold tea, and the particular knowledge of what it has meant to be this thing, in this time, in this place. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. You return to your room. You do not relight the candle. You sit in the darkness for a while, the moonlight coming through the shoji in the pale, diffuse way that paper screens distribute light. Not the direct brightness of an open window, but something softer and more even. The light made ambient by the paper, filling the room with a quality of illumination that is neither day nor night, but something Japan's aesthetic tradition has understood and valued for a very long time. The sword is on its stand. You cannot see it in this light, but you know exactly where it is. Tomorrow the world will continue its transformation. The decrees will be enforced. The new army will drill on its Western methods. The telegraph will transmit its messages along the wires strung between cities that are beginning, slowly, to look different from the cities of even 10 years ago. The young men of the new government will continue their remarkable, exhausting, slightly desperate project of making Japan into something that the black ships cannot threaten. They will succeed. Japan will be, by the end of the century, a power that surprises the world. It will surprise the world with the speed and completeness of its transformation, and it will surprise the world again with the consequences of that transformation, with what a country that has learned so quickly and so thoroughly how to be modern will do with that modernity. But that is the future, and the future is not your concern tonight. Tonight is the moonlight on the shoji. Tonight is the pine tree in the garden. Tonight is the sword on its stand and the cold tea and the 700 years that are ending quietly in a small room in Kyoto, while the rest of Japan moves towards something new. You lie down. The tatami is firm beneath you. The moonlight fills the room with its pale, even light. Somewhere in the garden, a single cricket is singing. Sleep now. The world will change when it changes. Tonight, you are still what you have always been.